Let's talk about sugar fast for a second. People are getting shredded on it, and people are actually saying it's improving their HbA1c.
Any eating pattern that leans so heavily on carbohydrates is built around the one macronutrient that humans don't actually need to survive or even thrive, I would say. Yes, you've heard me. There is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate.
Those with obesity and metabolic dysfunction should be very cautious about assuming a low-protein, high-carb diet.
Fructose is 7 times more glycating than glucose. And that's fact number one that the people recommending the sugar diet don't know.
High sugar intake imposes a large fructose challenge on the body. And fructose as a molecule can be harmful, especially to the liver. Sugar diet influencers have missed this point.
The sugar diet has been helping people lose weight and improve their blood sugar regulation, which is catching the attention of the health world, and we're seeing a lot of the low-carb diet advocates respond, saying that even if the diet helps you lose weight or improve your blood sugar, you still shouldn't do it because high-carb diets will increase your appetite and cause overeating, carbohydrates will cause glycation, carbohydrates aren't essential, so you shouldn't be centering your diet around them, or that the high-carb diets won't be effective for people who are already insulin resistant or obese. So we'll be digging into all of these responses today. And as you may already know, I don't actually think the sugar diet is the ideal diet. It's generally not something that I recommend, but I have personally been eating a high carb, high sugar diet for over 10 years. And I also use a high carb and high sugar diet to help people reverse all sorts of health issues. So I have been happy to see this diet gain traction because it's been forcing people throughout the alternative health world, and especially in the low carb space, to acknowledge that people can lose weight and improve insulin resistance while eating a lot of carbohydrates or even eating a lot of sugar. And this is the direct opposite of the general low-carb narrative, which is that carbs inherently cause insulin resistance and fat gain, and they're responsible for obesity and metabolic syndrome, especially the massive skyrocketing of these issues that we're seeing in the Western world. And we've discussed the evidence against this model. This is called the carb insulin model of obesity. We've discussed this prior and also what actually causes insulin resistance many times before in the Energy Balance podcast and elsewhere, so you can check out those episodes. But as far as the sugar diet goes, because this diet is out there right now, the low-carb advocates are acknowledging that carbohydrates don't inherently cause weight gain. They don't inherently cause insulin resistance. And instead, now we're seeing them resort to other reasons as to why it might be a bad idea to incorporate carbohydrates in your diet. So let's take a look at some of the prominent figures in the low-carb space discussing the sugar diet and the reasons that they give as to why you shouldn't be eating a high-carb diet, even if it doesn't cause insulin resistance or weight gain. Of course, I'm not going to be digging into each of the criticisms brought up by these individuals. And as I mentioned, I'm not a particular fan of the sugar diet, so I have my own criticisms of it as well. But I just really want to point out some that I think are worth discussing here and that are that translate to other carbohydrate-containing diets. Now, of course, the focus in a lot of these videos is on the lack of protein in this diet and the stimulation of FGF21 being responsible for the benefits. I've discussed this at length in a prior podcast episode, so feel free to check that one out. But we're not going to be focusing as much on that because, that's something that is pretty unique to the sugar diet here. But instead, we'll be focusing on more so the arguments related to just consuming carbohydrates in your diet. And it's worth pointing out that the arguments here are very different from this argument that we've heard for a very long time in the low-carb space, which is that high-carb diets inherently cause insulin resistance and that low-carb diets inherently reverse insulin resistance independent of calorie intake. It's just about the carbohydrates. Again, this is the carb insulin model of obesity. Basically, you eat carbohydrates, insulin increases. This leads to fat storage, and over time, this also causes insulin resistance. This is that model that we've been told, and the arguments that we're going to be going through here are generally singing a different tune because they're seeing that people are actually losing weight and improving insulin sensitivity on these diets. So there has to be something else wrong with them, right? If it's not that. So we're going to start by digging into this video from Ben Bikman. It's titled "The Sugar Diet: What the Science Really Says and Why It May Work for Some." And we're going to start out here with him discussing the group of people that seem to be having benefits on the sugar diet.
A notable issue with the sugar diet is that many, if not all, of the advocates of the sugar diet that I've seen, in fact, all of them that I can think of, and that as I was thinking of when I was creating some talking points here, they are very lean, highly active men. That is the twofold description of these individuals. Very lean, actually three. Very lean, very physically active, and they're all dudes. That to me introduces some confounding variables. There's very high muscle mass, very high physical activity rates. Because of both of those, there's very high insulin sensitivity and very high glucose tolerance. Those are not the same thing. But it certainly means these are guys who are able to process high loads of refined sugars without much denting of their metabolic function. But there's a worry there to me that if you start to apply this diet broadly, is everyone going to respond the same way?
All right, so Ben is saying here that the people who are doing the sugar diet, they're lean, they have a lot of muscle mass, and they're highly active, and they're men. And I think the first thing to mention here is just that this isn't true. There's a lot of women doing the sugar diet. There are also men who have done the sugar diet who were overweight and have lost weight. It doesn't take too long of searching on YouTube for people doing the sugar diet to find people who don't fit that or those parameters. But even more important here is this idea that, it kind of goes back to this idea of almost earning your carbohydrates, right? If you're more active and you have more muscle mass, that's when you can metabolize the carbs. That's when you can eat a lot of carbs without it being an issue. And the reality is that that's not at all what we see in terms of the research or, of course, in practice either. High-carb, low-fat diets have been shown to be very effective in both men and women, and in people who have type 2 diabetes, people who have insulin resistance, people who are overweight and obese. And they're able to not only lead to weight loss, but also lead to dramatic improvements in insulin sensitivity and type 2 diabetes as well. A couple of notable examples of this include Kepner's rice diet, which Dr. Bikman actually mentioned in his video here. This was done in people who were obese and who had type 2 diabetes and other issues related to metabolic syndrome. We also have the Pritikin diets, which also were done in the similar groups of people, and both of those had incredible results in terms of insulin resistance and weight loss and a number of other parameters. And there are tons of other studies too, and not all of them also, just for what it's worth, used very low amounts of protein. That's something that Dr. Bikman had mentioned earlier in this video, was that one of the comparisons between the sugar diet is the Kepner rice diet, and that's true, but there's also been a ton of high-carb, low-fat diets that have been used and shown to have incredible benefits, even with moderate amounts of protein included. And so, this idea that this is only going to apply to this very particular set of individuals just isn't what we're seeing in terms of the individuals' experiences. That's not what we're seeing in terms of the anecdotes, and it's not what we're seeing in terms of the literature either. There's too many studies to count of people who are not in that category of lean, highly active men with a lot of muscle mass who are seeing benefits on high-carb, low-fat diets. Now, of course, that isn't everything that encapsulates the sugar diet itself, but just in general, when we're extrapolating this into other high carbohydrate, lower fat diets, that's what we see. Now, the next point that Dr. Bikman brings up has to do with satiety on a high-carb diet, and we'll get to that in a second, but I did just want to mention first that while I don't actually advocate for the sugar diet, I do recommend a high-carb diet that's tailored toward optimizing your metabolism and your individual needs. So if you want to take a look at the foods that I'd recommend including on an optimal diet, then make sure to download the free Energy Balance Food Guide. The food guide will help you determine exactly what to eat to optimally support your metabolism and help you lose weight, improve your digestion, get amazing sleep, boost your energy, and so much more. The Energy Balance Food Guide is a one-page infographic that organizes foods on a spectrum based on how effectively they support your metabolism, and it also has a separate spectrum that adjusts this scale for you in the case that you're dealing with various digestive issues. The food guide makes it extremely easy to get started with a bioenergetic approach to optimizing your health, so head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/guide to download your free Energy Balance Food Guide. All right, so with that, let's listen in to the next point that we're going to discuss here from Dr. Ben Bikman regarding satiety on a high-carb diet and potentially on the sugar diet itself.
And with all of that in mind, one important aspect to consider is satiety, this feeling of fullness that will drive our hunger and eating. Research on high-carb diets particularly those emphasizing simple sugars, like in the sugar diet, show mixed but usually concerning effects on satiety. Some studies indicate that high-carb meals can lead to a quicker return of hunger compared to meals higher in protein or fat. For example, one of the studies that I have in my citation list is a 2014 study that had participants consuming a high-carb, low-fat breakfast, and they reported a significantly faster and stronger return to hunger.
All right, so what we essentially have here is this idea that eating a higher carb diet is going to lead to less satiety, so it's going to naturally cause you to eat more. And I mean, I think when it comes to the sugar diet, we can definitely look at people's individual experiences. We can look at the anecdotes, and I think, even if for most people trying it for themselves, I think it's pretty hard to overeat. Again, for the vast majority, when you're only eating one macronutrient, it's hard to eat that much in terms of just carbohydrates, and especially if you limit it to just sugar. So I really don't think that would apply specifically to the sugar diet. But when we broaden this, he does mention a high carb diet on the whole is something that leads to less satiety and increased appetite. And he mentions, one study here looking at an individual meal that's a higher carb meal versus a lower carb meal, mentions that there's a quicker return to hunger after. I'm not sure exactly what the study is he's referring to there. He mentioned a citation list. I'm not sure where that's located because I didn't see that. But he also mentioned some other studies talking about high carb diets, and especially ones that are higher in sucrose or sugars, leading to increased appetite. And again, I'm not sure exactly what studies he's referring to there, but I have seen research that looks at higher carb diets with high amounts of sucrose versus high amounts of starch that do show that people eat more on the higher sucrose diet. So, there may be something to that direct comparison, although I think it's worth noting here that I don't think eating more is inherently a bad thing. I think that we actually would want to be able to get to a place where we can eat more, increase our metabolic rate, and that actually is something that can lead to better health. But just taking this back to high carb diets in general, there's a number of studies looking at high carb, low fat diets that are ad libitum, meaning that the participants can eat as much as they want. And they show that when people go onto these higher carb, low fat diets, they lose weight and they actually naturally eat less, despite eating a lot of carbohydrates, which are supposed to be addictive. Yet again, they're actually eating less on these diets and they lose weight. And none of these studies suggested that people should be limiting simple sugars or sugar-dense foods, other than one of them which did just emphasize incorporating higher fiber carbohydrate sources. But outside of that, none of these studies are saying, we're telling the participants to avoid sugars in any way. And they were, of course, encouraging them to eat a very high-carb diet. And another example of this would be the Kempner diet, which again, I referenced already, but that's one that includes white sugar and dextrose used ad libitum, meaning that participants can have as much of those as they want, and they were eating as much as over 500 grams a day of carbohydrates. And in the diet protocol, they were allowed to use as much as 500 grams of sugar from these sources, from white sugar and dextrose. And yet there were still incredible benefits on that diet for weight loss and insulin sensitivity. So this suggestion that if somebody's eating a high carb diet, they're inherently going to eat more just is not at all what we see when we look at the literature. And of course, when we look at people's experiences and the people who I work with, there's an aspect of this that's true, which is that if you're coming from a low carb diet and you bring in some carbohydrates, there's going to be really strong desires to eat more. But that has more to do with the long-term carbohydrate restriction than it does an inherent carbohydrate addiction or an inherent aspect of carbohydrates that causes a disproportionate increase in appetite. And again, I've worked with a ton of people who have been in that scenario and thought that they couldn't eat carbs or else they would overeat. They would eat too much. They had a sugar addiction. They weren't able to stop themselves once they started eating carbs. And what they actually found was that after a period of time of incorporating healthy carbohydrates into their diet, that went away. That effect where they, as soon as they had a bite of something with carbohydrates or sugar, they would eat the whole thing. That effect went away when their bodies were actually getting what they needed. So with that in mind, let's move on to the next point that I'd like to discuss here in terms of carbohydrates being an essential nutrient or not being an essential nutrient, and whether this means that we should be consuming them or not.
Now, one final comment on this is a concern that any Any eating pattern that leans so heavily on carbohydrates is built around the one macronutrient that humans don't actually need to survive or even thrive, I would say. There are such things as proteins that a person must eat. Essential amino acids would come in those proteins. There are such things as essential fats that a person must eat to maintain their health and survive. There is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. So just at a foundational level, I can't help but wince a little at a diet that is so heavily focused on the one macronutrient that is not essential. Yes, you've heard me. There is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. Now, I'm not saying that let's not eat any. I'm not saying that, but you could.
Oh man. So this is an argument we've unfortunately heard over and over again. It's, I think, really the weakest talking point within the low carb sphere, and one that's really misleading, right? People hear this and they think that, that carbohydrates aren't essential, and that means that they're not important. And especially when, Dr. Bikman says this here with such conviction, right? This is such an important point. This is a novel idea. No one's ever thought about this before, but carbohydrates aren't actually essential. You don't actually need to eat them to survive. I mean, so just to explain again what we're talking about here, and we have talked about this in detail in the past, so I'll just keep it brief here. But when we're talking about essentiality here, we're not talking about something that's essential to our physiology. Glucose and carbohydrates are absolutely essential to our physiology. But rather what we're talking about here is whether something is essential to our diet, meaning that we have to eat it as opposed to us being able to produce it. So in the case of carbohydrates, we have the capacity to produce carbohydrates because of how important carbohydrates are to our physiology. We have this process called gluconeogenesis. So we don't actually need to eat them, because if we don't eat them, we can still produce them endogenously. Our bodies can still produce them. Now, this, of course, doesn't mean that we should or shouldn't be consuming them, but it's worth expanding on this a little bit, because I think that people are not thinking too hard about this idea. So, often it's cited that there's not essential carbohydrates, but there are essential proteins or amino acids and essential fats. When it comes to amino acids, there are 9 essential amino acids and more that are not essential. And when you calculate out the requirement for an average 150-pound person, give or take, the requirement for essential amino acids is around 13 grams a day. There are no requirements for any amino acids outside of that. That is the only amount that's actually essential, is 13 grams a day of those essential amino acids. When it comes to fats, the only essential fats are omega-6s and omega-3s. Monounsaturated fats are not essential. Saturated fats are not essential. We can produce both of those endogenously. And the requirement for omega-6s and omega-3s is extremely small, somewhere in the range of 1 or 2 grams per day. Outside of that, any other fat that's consumed, 100% non-essential at all. So this idea that we shouldn't be centering a diet, basing a diet around a non-essential nutrient, is basically saying that you shouldn't be having a diet that is centered around anything other than 13 grams a day of essential amino acids and 1 or 2 grams a day of essential fatty acids. And that's the only thing we should be focused on in our diet. Now, obviously, the low-carb advocates do not recommend or advocate for that sort of a diet. They recommend for consuming far more protein than the 13 grams a day of essential amino acids, and far more fats than the omega-6s and omega-3s that you only need 1 gram or 2 a day of. So the vast majority, or I shouldn't even say it that way, I would just say that low-carb diets are also based on non-essential nutrients, meaning mostly saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, and non-essential protein. That's where most of the calories are coming from. So this is essentially a meaningless talking point. The idea that carbs are not essential dietarily doesn't mean that we should or shouldn't consume them. It doesn't say anything about whether or not they're beneficial to be consuming. And that this is the level of argument that we're left with when we have to acknowledge that someone can eat a lot of carbohydrates and still be metabolically healthy, and they don't have to be exercising in insane excessive amounts in order to be metabolizing them or anything like that. And we'll be coming back to this, because this is not the only person here who's going to make that argument. All right, but with that, let's move on to some of the arguments made by Thomas DeLauer. And we're just going to be talking about one in particular that is not just unique to this video of Thomas DeLauer's, but there's a couple other low-carb advocates who make the same argument. And so this is from his video titled Low Carb Diets Causing Insulin Resistance, What is Going On? And we're just going to start with this earlier clip where he's talking about the sugar diet and sugar fasting leading to weight loss and improved blood sugar regulation.
Let's talk about sugar fast for a second. In case you haven't heard about this thing that's sweeping the nation, sugar fasting is where you keep your protein super, super, super low and you keep your fats very, very low and you just go high carbohydrate, predominantly sugar. People are getting shredded on it and people are actually saying it's improving their HbA1c. But if you look at the comments, you look at the people that are doing this, you got a large amount of people that are having success, but you also have a lot of people that are not. Okay, so it's not a cure-all. And I think it can be used as a short-term intervention. The idea behind it is that when you reduce your fats and you reduce your protein and you increase your carbs, the cells have no choice but to start learning to develop the machinery to use carbs again.
All right, so a couple of points here. For one, it's great to see Thomas DeLauer acknowledging that people are having these benefits on sugar fasting and the sugar diet. They're seeing weight loss. They're seeing improved blood sugar regulation. He also mentioned that there's some people who are not having success, which is absolutely true too. And of course, also an important point to acknowledge. But what I like is, the second half of what he's saying here, which is that he's acknowledging that increasing carbohydrate intake leads to improvements in carb utilization and leads to improvements in insulin sensitivity. He also touches on the FGF21 component, which is an independent component, again, that leads to its own effects that I would say are largely not beneficial. I think they're largely negative. Again, I talked through that in depth in a prior episode. But it's great to see him acknowledge that eating more carbs actually improves carbohydrate utilization and increases insulin sensitivity. And that's true. And we see that, as people increase carbohydrate intake, and especially on extremely high carb diets, in the literature, it's very clear that those improve insulin sensitivity and glucose utilization. But then let's move on to a later part in this video where Thomas DeLauer voices why, despite that, we might not want to continue eating a high carb diet for our health.
Now, if we kind of come over to the sugar diet for just a second, if that's a route that you want to go, I encourage you to do it in short bursts, okay? Because even though you can drop fat with it, even though there's mechanistic evidence as to how it works, one of the things that I just encourage you to really think about the most is that it's all about long-term exposure to something, right? With low carb and keto, we were talking about how do we marinate the cells in the right kind of fatty acids so that they ultimately condition the cell to change its transport vehicles for different fuels. The same kind of thing is true with sugar. We're trying to marinate the cells in sugar so they upregulate the transport mechanisms. The problem is that with sugar, we have glycation that occurs. We don't have that happening so much with fats. I mean, yes, it can. Okay, but with sugar, you're increasing the risk of advanced glycation in products significantly by consuming a whole lot of it.
All right, so high carb diet might be great for insulin sensitivity, might help you lose some weight, but if your cells are being bathed in carbohydrates in the long term, if there's long-term exposure, then there's going to be glycation. That's what Thomas DeLauer is mentioning here, and he did actually mention that fats can drive glycation or advanced glycation end products as well, which they can. We'll be talking about that. We'll get into all of this in a little bit more detail, but it's also worth mentioning just really briefly that if you're improving insulin sensitivity and you're improving carbohydrate utilization, then there's not actually long-term exposure to, high amounts of blood sugar or excessive amounts of glucose itself, because it'll be quickly converted into energy or, converted to glycogen or going down other pathways as it's used. So there's actually a little bit of a contradiction here where when you're seeing improved insulin sensitivity, you actually are going to have less exposure to carbohydrates, which is, I think, one of the aspects of a high carb diet that ends up creating a bit of a paradox for people in the low carb space. But we'll come back to that. Now, of course, it's also worth mentioning too that on a low carb, high fat diet, there is still carbohydrate exposure. There's still glucose exposure as well, even if you're not getting it from the diet. So we'll talk about that too. But first, we're going to hear from a couple of other low carb advocates who are also voicing the same concern, and we'll kind of address all of it together. So we hear that here from this video from Dr. Ken Berry titled "The Sugar Diet Revealed: Doctors Promoting the Sugar Diet." And this is a rather sarcastic video, which kind of comes through in this part of the clip.
So sugar glycates your cells and tissues in your body. This means it gums them up. The sugar sticks to your cells and to your tissues and makes them work less efficiently. Again, nobody cares about that because we're all just here to lose 20 pounds, right? So what a lot of people who are recommending the sugar diet don't know and also don't care about is that fructose, the sugar that occurs in fruit, super healthy. It's natural sugar. It's not like that artificial sugar made of sugar beets and sugar cane. It's natural sugar. It occurs in fruit, so therefore it's magically nutritious. Fructose is 7 times more glycating than glucose. And that's fact number one that the people recommending the sugar diet don't know, but that's irrelevant. Nobody cares about that. We're just here to lose some weight, right?
All right, so we've got a couple points here from Dr. Ken Berry, which is that sure, you can lose weight on a high-carb diet, but you're going to be dealing with glycation, and especially if you're consuming fructose glycates 7 times more than glucose, so you're going to be dealing with extra glycation if you're consuming fructose. So we'll be talking about that as well. Again, we're hearing this through line, which is this acknowledgement that you can lose weight while eating carbohydrates, but there's going to be some sort of a negative effect. And obviously, I agree that just because there's weight loss doesn't mean that you're also improving your health. I think that there's a ton of examples of that, a low-carb diet often being one of them. But in any case, let's move on here and listen to what Dr. Anthony Chaffee has to say about glycation on the sugar diet or on a high-carb diet, and then we'll talk about glycation itself. And this is from a video titled "The Truth About the Sugar Diet, Not What You'd Expect."
But again, it's not just about weight loss, because weight loss isn't the end all be all. When you're eating this amount of sugar, you're going to massively increase your blood sugar. You're going to increase your insulin. You're going to increase glycation. You're going to increase fructation. And it's going to cause a lot of harm in people's health. This is going to make your blood sugar spike. There's all the damages, all the ravages of type 2 diabetes come from elevated blood sugar causing glycation, damage to your blood vessels, damage to your organs, hormonal disruptions from the insulin affecting hundreds of different physiological processes in your body and your brain. And now you're spiking this up and you're getting a disruption and imbalance in those hormones and physiological processes.
All right. So what we're hearing here is not just that you're going to be getting glycation, and we're actually hearing something that is directly contradicting what we heard earlier from Thomas DeLauer, which is this idea that you're going to have more blood sugar, more insulin, and that's going to be causing all these issues largely via glycation, and that's responsible for all the negative effects seen in type 2 diabetes and on from there. But again, all coming back to glycation. So I'll be doing an entire episode on glycation in the near future. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the quick points here when it comes to why you don't actually need to be concerned about glycation on a healthy high carbohydrate diet. So one of the main concerns that's pointed to is that if you're eating carbohydrates, you're going to get a blood sugar spike, but it's worth noting that even on a low carb diet, there's still considerable glucose excursions. You still have quite a bit of glucose elevation after eating. This is especially from the protein consumed. And you can see that here in this study. This was a metabolic ward study on men who were healthy men. They didn't have diabetes, and they were on a ketogenic diet for 4 weeks. And they look at the blood glucose area under the curve on a ketogenic diet when they're eating a ketogenic meal. And they found that it was actually higher, not statistically higher, but it was higher than the blood sugar area under the curve for the baseline diet, the high carbohydrate diet, eating a high carbohydrate meal. So again, just to clarify that, they saw a greater increase in glucose, the area under the curve, so the total increase in glucose for the people on a ketogenic diet eating a ketogenic meal versus the people on a high carb diet eating a high carb meal. And again, it wasn't statistically higher. It was actually just, when you're looking at statistical significance, it was just the same. But even so, we're seeing the same amount of blood sugar increase from low carb meals on a low carb diet in this study. And in general, you're going to still see excursions in glucose and insulin from the protein on a low-carb diet, and especially on a carnivore diet if you're eating extra amounts of protein. So this idea that you're only going to see increases in blood sugar on a high-carb diet is absolutely not the case. Now, the next thing to touch on here briefly is fructose. So Dr. Ken Berry pointed out that fructose will glycate 7 times faster than glucose, which it is shown to be true in vitro. That's where that data comes from. But of course, when we're looking at the human body, we have to look at the actual levels of fructose that someone's exposed to. And so what we actually find is that the levels of fructose in the blood are extremely low. At baseline, they're typically around 100 times less than baseline levels of glucose. So again, 100 times being far greater than the 7 times more glycation you might get from fructose. And even when massive amounts of fructose are given in studies, including as much as the amount of fructose in 4 cans of soda that's given all at once, the peak levels of fructose only reach around 7 milligrams per deciliter, which is still 15 to 20 times less than a typical glucose spike after eating, some amount of healthy carbohydrates, and it's still 10 times less or even more than, a typical fasting level of glucose. So even if you were consuming insanely massive amounts of fructose, the levels in the blood are still going to be far lower than would warrant concern when compared to glucose levels. Now, of course, the other point here to mention is not just looking at the bloodstream, but what's going on in the tissues, because the reality is that most glycation that we're actually concerned about isn't going on in the bloodstream, it's in the tissues. But when fructose is absorbed into the bloodstream, largely it goes to the liver, and it doesn't just stay as fructose where it could cause glycation or fructation. Instead, it's quickly used to produce energy, which you see here where you have the arrow going to carbon dioxide. And then outside of that, largely it's going to be converted to glycogen, or it's going to be converted to glucose and lactate in the liver and then sent out for other tissues to utilize. And then typically less than 1% of the fructose that comes in is converted into triglycerides. But in any case, it's not going to be staying as fructose. So this idea that you should be concerned about fructose causing glycation or fructation really just isn't warranted, because you don't have a bunch of free fructose hanging around even if you're consuming fructose. Now, when it comes to glycation as a whole, it's true that glucose and fructose can cause glycation, but they're not the only factors that drive glycation. One of the things that we want to be most concerned about are what are called dicarbonyls. And one of the main dicarbonyls that we have that can be produced is called methylglyoxal. And methylglyoxal is extremely glycating. It's 20,000 times more glycating than glucose. And low carb and ketogenic diets especially actually increase the amount of methylglyoxal considerably. So you can see that here in this study, where the people who were in ketosis, this was looking at people on low carb diets, but the ones who actually were in ketosis doubled their methylglyoxal levels. And again, methylglyoxal being 20,000 times more glycating than glucose. So even if you're not consuming any glucose, because you're producing ketones and specifically acetone, which in the process of converting acetone into glucose for gluconeogenesis, so that we have this essential nutrient in glucose that we can utilize, you have to produce methylglyoxal, and that's why you tend to see high levels of methylglyoxal in ketosis. Now, again, that's not the only driver of glycation, or especially glycation end products. Now, the one that we're most concerned about are called AGEs, advanced glycation end products. And it's important to note that lipid peroxides, so damaged fats, are actually major precursors to advanced glycation end products. So even if you're on a low-carb diet and you took all of the glucose out of your body, which of course would be impossible because it's an important nutrient that's necessary physiologically, but even if you were able to do that, you would still have glycation, you would still have the formation of advanced glycation end products from damage to fats. So this idea that if you avoid carbohydrates, you're going to have no glycation, and if you have carbohydrates, you'll have a lot of glycation, is just obviously blatantly not at all the case. And there's another really important side of the equation to consider, which is the clearance of glycation end products and also the factors that cause the formation of the advanced glycation end products especially. So when we're talking about dicarbonyls like methylglyoxal or lipid peroxides, we want to make sure that we're protected against these. And some of the main factors that protect us include glutathione, an enzyme called glyoxylase, and then also a category of enzymes called aldoketo reductases. And essentially, all of these enzymes are involved in clearing out the factors that are going to drive the worst glycation. And in general, these pathways, these antioxidant pathways, are depleted from oxidative stress and inflammation. Now, on the flip side, there are things that actually support the activity of these antioxidants, and that would actually be carbohydrates and insulin itself. Insulin actually increases glutathione synthesis, and it increases glyoxylase expression, both of which help to clear out the dicarbonyls and the lipid peroxides that are actually causing advanced glycation end products. And glucose is also really important here through what's called the pentose phosphate pathway, where it helps to regenerate NADPH, which is needed for the aldoketo reductases and also for regenerating glutathione, that again is also needed as one of these antioxidants here. So having enough glucose and enough insulin is actually incredibly important for making sure that you don't have too much glycation, despite what we're being told here. And again, this idea that you're either going to be exposed to glycating glucose and fructose on a high-carb diet versus not at all on a low-carb diet is just not at all true. We're just making things up at this point when it comes to glycation. And again, I'll do an entire episode digging into glycation in more detail in the future. But I want to dig into a couple of other arguments here from Nick Norwitz. And the first is going to be regarding what's called FGF21 resistance. Now, again, FGF21 is something that's increased on a sugar diet if you're eating very little protein. And so let's listen to what he has to say here.
Who should not do the sugar diet? Importantly, this is really, really important, so listen up. Obesity is thought to be an FGF21 resistant state, and this has been demonstrated in animals and in humans. In fact, FGF21 levels are higher in persons with obesity and correlate positively with BMI and correlate with signatures of metabolic syndrome, including high insulin, high triglycerides, and low HDL cholesterol. Therefore, higher FGF21 is not better per se, nor does it mean you're actually getting more FGF21 signaling. Obesity is an FGF21 resistant state. Therefore, those with obesity and metabolic dysfunction should be very cautious about assuming a low-protein, high-carb diet, in my opinion.
All right. So we're hearing a couple of things here from Nick. And of course, there's truth to this idea that there's FGF21 resistance seen in obesity and type 2 diabetes as well. And we will talk about that, but it's also worth noting that when it comes to the sugar diet, there's such emphasis being placed on the FGF21, and it seems like this is a way to ignore the other aspects of the diet, the fact that a high-carb and low-fat diet actually can help dramatically with insulin sensitivity and weight loss. So we'll be coming back to that as well in a moment here. But it is, worth highlighting that it's true that there's a level of FGF21 resistance seen in these states, and there are high FGF21 levels seen in these states. The FGF21 levels aren't actually driven by the same mechanisms as they are on the sugar diet, but nonetheless, we do see elevated FGF21. But it's worth noting that just because there's resistance doesn't mean that there's not going to be any response to increased FGF21, and there are actually still going to be responses seen, and that's why FGF21 analogs that are being researched do still show an effect in these populations. It's just not quite as potent of an effect. But again, I think it's somewhat important to highlight. But this idea that this diet is only going to help, or in general, a high carb, low fat diet is only going to help with somebody who does not have obesity or type 2 diabetes, I think is a major disservice. And this focus on FGF21 is a part of that, because the reality is that we see incredible benefits in high-carb, low-fat diets in people with obesity and type 2 diabetes, where they're able to get off of insulin, get off of medications to regulate their blood sugar. They're able to see incredible weight loss. And by attributing all of the effects of the sugar diet to FGF21, we're really ignoring the other benefits here that are seen from providing a lot of carbohydrates and lowering the fat in these sorts of instances. Again, I mentioned this in terms of the Kempner diet, the Pritikin diet, where in both of these people are able to lose weight, they're able to get off of hypoglycemic drugs, and they see incredible improvement, sometimes even in weeks' times. And there's a ton of other studies showing benefits of high-carb and low-fat diets in obesity and type 2 diabetes. So it's true that the FGF21 aspect here from the low protein aspect of the sugar diet might not be in play as much when it comes to people with obesity or type 2 diabetes, but that doesn't mean that this sort of a diet, not necessarily the sugar diet, but a high carb and lower fat diet, can't be incredibly beneficial for people in this category, and the reality is that it is. So let's move on to another point brought up here from Nick Norwitz regarding the long-term consumption of carbohydrates and fructose.
Moving on, another question that's important to ask is 5 weeks long enough? I'd like to return to the point that the primary study we discussed was only 5 weeks of a low-protein diet feeding. What would happen if the study was extended for many months? My concerns here are twofold. First, high sugar intake imposes a large fructose challenge on the body. And fructose as a molecule can be harmful, especially to the liver, when consumed in large quantities. Now, at reasonable or lower intake levels, the small intestine is actually very good at defending the liver because it converts fructose into other sugars and organic acids before the fructose has a chance to traverse the portal vein to hit the liver. Now, in recent discussions, I'll just add, around the sugar diet influencers have missed this point. I'm not going to point fingers, but I think it's an important point to highlight. So in the context of the sugar diet, it's possible or likely that this system is overwhelmed, saturated, and the liver is taking abuse from high-dose fructose. Over longer periods of time, more than 5 weeks, this could cause metabolic derangements.
All right, so Nick is telling us here that fructose itself can be harmful to the liver, cause metabolic syndrome, cause all sorts of negative downstream effects. And we have talked about this numerous times in podcast episodes because I think this is an incredibly pervasive myth, misconception, an area where we need to be looking at the research with a lot more depth. And I'll just keep it brief here. Again, we've talked about this quite a bit prior, but essentially most of the concerns when it comes to fructose at the liver have to do with things like ATP depletion, uric acid production, increases in de novo lipogenesis, and some other related mechanisms. But the studies that show these sorts of increases have a ton of issues. Typically, they're done in animal models using pure fructose, and pure fructose is very poorly absorbed, and this leads to the feeding of bacteria and an increase in endotoxin production, which endotoxin alone actually causes all of these issues in the liver. And there's studies where they provide antibiotics alongside the fructose, and it actually prevents any of these negative effects by preventing the increase in endotoxin. Of course, it's also worth mentioning that the amount of fructose used in these animal models is absolutely excessive. Sometimes it's more than could ever actually be consumed in a human diet or in any non-lab diet because they use 60+% of the total calories coming from fructose, which, when we look at nature, the vast majority of fructose sources are about 50% fructose and 50% glucose. So that wouldn't even be possible with any normal food. Even if you were having pure high fructose corn syrup, that's only 55% fructose and 45% glucose. So even if you were only eating high fructose corn syrup, you wouldn't get that high of an amount. There are, of course, other studies that don't use quite as excessive amounts, but in general, the amounts used are incredibly high. And it's worth noting that rodents notably have a very poor capacity for handling fructose in the liver compared to humans. We have a pretty robust capacity for utilizing fructose effectively before it would start to cause any sort of issues, before it would spill over and start to create these other downstream effects that are often pointed to. And this is why we see in the human research as well that in order to create these sorts of effects, they essentially require excessive amounts of fructose given on top of a normal diet in a hypercaloric situation. Basically, in order to see, for example, an increase in uric acid, there has to be, hypercaloric, massive amounts of fructose given, oftentimes as fructose-sweetened beverages, and there are a number of other parameters needed to create even any amount of increases in these different pathways and mechanisms. So something that's definitely not actually applicable to humans in 99% of contexts. And we see this in the various meta-analyses as well that look at fructose intake, where if you have isocaloric substitution with fructose for other carbohydrates, it doesn't actually cause those negative effects. You don't see increases in weight gain, fatty liver disease, insulin sensitivity when given in an isocaloric situation. When you have massive doses of fructose given in hypercaloric trials, that's where you start to see those negative effects. And this is pretty clear in the meta-analyses as well. And of course, there are tons of examples of high-carb, low-fat diets given for long periods of time that don't create issues despite containing a large amount of fructose. One, again, that I'll come back to is the Kempner diet, which included white sugar and dextrose ad libitum, so they were consuming quite a bit of sugar, plus from other sources. The total amount of carbohydrates were about 565 to 570 grams per day, and they saw incredible improvements in insulin resistance and general health parameters. And this would be for extended periods of time. In some of these studies, they're looking for almost 2 years at participants on this diet and seeing pretty great improvements in terms of various health parameters. So again, this idea that long-term consumption of carbohydrates and especially fructose will be causing some negative effects really just is not at all supported. Which brings us to the last argument that I want to touch on here from Nick, which again comes back to the essentiality of carbohydrates.
Additionally, a concern is there are essential fatty acids, essential fat-soluble vitamins, and essential amino acids. but there are no essential carbohydrates. So when practiced over a longer time course, the sugar diet seems extremely high risk for nutrient deficiencies.
All right, so we're getting this same narrative here that there aren't any essential carbohydrates, but there are essential amino acids, there are essential fats. So we shouldn't be basing our diet on these carbohydrates, or we're going to become deficient. We're going to have nutrient deficiencies. It almost, when most people are talking about nutrient deficiencies, they're talking about vitamins and minerals. It sounds like here Nick is just talking about a fatty acid deficiency or a protein deficiency or an amino acid deficiency, which, I think would be really a stretch. In order to create a fatty acid deficiency in research, they have to go on extremely processed lab-created diets to create any sort of an essential fatty acid deficiency. Again, we're talking about omega-6s and omega-3s here. With the amino acids, of course, if you're eating an extreme and low protein diet, there would be a deficiency there. Obviously, that's not something I recommend, and so there's a truth to the fact that there's a negative impact of not getting enough protein on a sugar diet. I agree with that, but the fact that you're eating essential carbohydrates doesn't really have anything to do with that. It's just the fact that you're not eating protein. And again, on the fat side, it's, if you're eating any amount of fat, which of course I do think you should, I don't agree with how low of fat is recommended on a sugar diet, then getting the amount of essential fats would happen naturally. It would be impossible not to. But again, it's also worth highlighting here because I think there's this conflation going on. And again, it's not 100% clear whether Nick is suggesting this, but it's worth noting that carbohydrate-containing foods have a ton of nutrients, including essential micronutrients. We're talking about tons of vitamins, B vitamins, vitamin C. We have a lot of minerals as well, a lot of potassium, magnesium. There's a number of nutrients, a ton of nutrients that are found in carbohydrate-containing foods. These aren't nutrient-devoid foods, even though carbohydrates themselves aren't essential. And it's also worth noting when we're comparing the non-essential carbohydrates to the non-essential fats, the monounsaturated and saturated, and even the essential fats, the omega-3s and omega-6s, if you're comparing carb sources versus fat sources, carb sources tend to be far more dense in micronutrients than fat sources. If you compare any fruit or root vegetable, even grains, which, I'm not necessarily an advocate for, but even if you were to compare any of those with, fats like butter or olive oil, or tallow, the carbohydrate sources are far more dense in the micronutrients. But let's continue on here because Nick does have a little bit more to say.
To be clear, I did not say low-protein diets are high risk for nutritional deficiencies per se. However, the sugar diet, as one form of low-protein diet, is often practiced as a very low-nutrient diet. Why? That's easy. Sour Patch Kids taste great.
Yeah, so kind of an interesting point here. I would actually say that low-protein diets are often nutrient deficient because a lot of really important nutrients come from protein sources. So kind of interesting to hear Nick say that here. I'm not sure exactly what he was getting at, but of course I agree that if you're on a typical sugar diet, there will be nutrient deficiencies in terms of micronutrients, and that's obvious. It just has nothing to do with the idea that carbohydrates are not essential. All right, well, that was all the clips to go through today. And again, just to be clear, I'm not advocating for the sugar diet. I don't think that this is an optimal diet. I do think there are inherent costs to the protein restriction and to the level of fat restriction. I think there's a place, I mentioned high carb and lower fat diets, and I think there's a place for that, but I generally don't recommend extremely low fat diets because there's a cost to that as well. So feel free to refer back to, prior episodes where I've talked about the sugar diet or insulin resistance if you're interested in those kinds of topics and the general amounts of fat that you might want to include in your diet depending on your scenario. But in general, instead of the sugar diet, I recommend a bioenergetic approach. As I mentioned earlier, the best place to start for implementing a bioenergetic approach would be the Energy Balance Food Guide, which you can download for free at jfeldmanwellness.com/guide. And with that, I'll see you on the next one.